Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for joining the very first ENLP webinar. We're very excited to get this off the ground. I'm Louise Durrant and I'll be chairing the webinar today. I also have Elaine Kennedy in the background for a bit of technical support to filter your questions, and we'll help to put those to Milka at the end of the session. We're keeping fingers crossed that technology is on our side and everything goes to plan, but if anything goes wrong, we apologise in advance. We're not technical wizards, and this is our first go, but it all seems to be going well so far, so fingers crossed. We have a sold out webinar today and a really mixed audience, representatives from 21 different countries, which is great. We have some ENLP alumni, but we do have quite a large proportion that are not alumni of the ENLP. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the ENLP for the benefit of those people. So the European Nutrition Leadership Platform, or ENLP for short, is the network of leaders in food and nutrition with a mission to train, inspire and connect leaders in food and nutrition. One of the main activities within this mission are the seminars that are run usually once a year in Luxembourg. There's an ENLP Essentials for young professionals, and then the ENLP Advanced Programme for mid to senior professionals in food and nutrition. As you can imagine, this year's programme was cancelled or postponed, but the ENLP board are working really hard to put in plans to make up for this. So please do watch this space, those of you who had either applied or were interested in future programmes. But there is so much more to the ENLP. The alumni also work hard to bring you a lot more opportunities beyond the seminars that are run. So there is the website and blog posts, as well as all the social media activity. And then there are local circle activities in the UK, in Greece, in the Netherlands and in Spain. And now there's also these webinars. So hopefully we're bringing you a little bit more from the ENLP beyond the programmes. Over the last year or so, the webinar working group have been working really hard to bring this webinar to life. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you to Eleanor, Anne, Helena, Elaine and Ellen, who have done most of the hard work to bring this webinar to the forefront. I only joined the committee more recently, so they have really done all the hard work. So thank you to the 5 of those for their work, and also thank you to our very first speaker. So during this webinar, please do share and discuss the topics that's being discussed on Twitter, on social media, using the details that are provided on the screen. So we have hashtag ENLP webinar. It'd be great if you can be active on social media and share it, and we will keep an eye on social media as well and retweet things so that we can share it beyond the numbers that have managed to join today. We will have some time as well for a Q&A, so if you have some questions, please submit them in the questions panel, and Elaine will again filter through those questions and we'll put some of those to Milka at the end of the session as well. And with that, I think it's about time we get started. So welcome to the very first ENLP webinar, very kindly presented by Dr Milka Sokolović from the European Food Information Council. She's the head of food and health science there. She will introduce herself during her presentation, so I won't go into it too much. But today she's hoping to share her expertise in nutrition science communication, and hoping to show us how communication isn't just a soft skill, but it's actually something we could use to improve public health. So I will hand over to Milka. This is when it takes us a moment. I'll hand over to Milka. So Milka, you should now get a little pop-up box. Perfect.
Can you see my screen already?
Yes, you look good to go. So I will mute myself and turn my camera off and hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Louise, very much for this kind introduction. I would say my aim today is dual. I kind of want to try to convince you in the importance of upping our game in science communication. Because if we don't talk about our science, someone else will. And we have already seen the impact of self-proclaimed science communicators, experts, and gurus. And the other hand would be to convince, the other thing would be to convince you on the importance of engaging stakeholders across the board if we are to increase the impact of our work and if we are to improve the public health. But indeed, let's start maybe with a bit of backgrounder. I am the director of the advanced program of the ENLP, and also in my real life, I'm head of food and health science in EUFIC. And EUFIC, or the European Food Information Council, is a non-profit organization, non-governmental, member-based, with about 3/4 of our funding coming from public sources and about 1/4 through membership. And our members range from 15 global food producers across the agri-food sector to 14 universities, research, non-profit, and NGOs. And I guess we are lucky to be able to collaborate with pretty much everyone in Europe in the field of food and nutrition. Now, my own background, and that is where this disclaimer is in order. I'm neither a nutritionist nor a trained science communicator. I come from the world of systems biology, where I studied the intermediary metabolism of conditions, anything from under to over nutrition in between. So I guess I could say I understand nutrition from the inside. And when it comes to the trade of passing knowledge, I guess I learned it the hard way through 7 years of academic teaching and 7 years of leading a science communication team. And what we do is we translate science to human language to help people make sense and use of it. Now, let me slowly glide into my presentation by sketching the world that we live in. And unfortunately, it is marked by the triple burden of malnutrition, by undernutrition, by overweight and obesity, and the vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Out of 7.6 billion of us, about half of us is malnourished. 2 billion of us are undernourished or suffer from vitamin and mineral deficiencies. 1.9 billion suffer from overweight and obesity, and 0.8 billion or 815 million people suffer from chronic hunger. And according to the last year's FAO data, this number is on the rise again after 10 years of stagnation. And we can only imagine how COVID pandemic will only worsen the situation here. If we look into the diet attributable mortality rates across the world, it seems that the problem of unhealthy eating is nowhere close to be solved. If we zoom into Europe, and this is the map that represents the regional overview of food insecurity in Europe and Central Asia. So this is FAO data from 2017. Our region also suffers from the triple burden of malnutrition. A number of countries are burdened with overnutrition and obesity, with Germany, the UK, Portugal, and Spain carrying the heaviest load. Then there is 5 countries in Central Asian region in which more than 5% of population suffer from undernutrition, and the most difficult vitamin and mineral deficiencies are those of iron, zinc, and vitamin A. We have also a number of countries that are burdened with a whole triple burden, like the Balkan countries, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. And then there are less concerned countries, marked in green in this map. And according to the concept of nutrition transition that you are all aware of, in these less concerned countries, there was a shift from predominant overnutrition to diminishing overnutrition, and that is thanks to behavior changes. That is thanks to the reduced fat intake, increased fruits, vegetable, carbs, and fiber intake, and to the increased physical activity. So one could say that the solutions are obvious, right? And that is to follow the established science-based advice. And that is to say, if we reduce fat consumption, increase fruit, veg, nuts, fiber intake, and replace sedentary behavior with active lifestyle, we are on the mark. And thankfully, in majority of the European countries, the science is translated into food-based dietary guidelines, which provides actionable advice on healthy diet and lifestyle. And the common advice from the majority of the countries is to eat a variety of foods in moderate amounts, to increase fruits and vegetables consumption, to decrease intake of foods high in saturated fat, salt, and sugar, and so forth. However, if we look into the global burden of disease data, and this is from the publication of 2019 that came out in Lancet last year's May, it is exactly the behaviors opposite from what science advises us that contribute to the highest mortality rates that are attributable to individual dietary risks. So it is diets high in sodium and then low in whole grains, fruit, nuts and seeds, vegetables, omega-3 fatty acids, and fiber. So I think we can say at least that there is a gaping hole between the scientific advice and people's behavior. And that leads me to the other aspect of the world that the nutrition science operates in, and that is the swirling nightmare of information quicksand. I don't need to tell you, you feel it yourself every day. We are exposed to incredible amount of information sources, being from social media or mainstream media, friends and family, health professionals, NGOs, governments, companies, you name it. And we tend to put the blame on the headlines, media headlines, but it's not only the headlines. Each of these sources tends to bring contradictory information almost on a daily basis when it comes to food and nutrition. And that obviously leads to confusion, and the confusion leads to fear, most often the unfounded fear in foods and food ingredients, and that leads to decreasing trust in foods, food value chain, and particularly in the food and nutrition science. So it is no wonder that we are lost in information and that critical thinking in this era is threatened. And that leads to yet another angle of the environment that I would like to discuss here, and that is the plummeting trust in pretty much everything around us. If you look into the Edelman overview of trust in the last 2 decades, you can notice at the beginning of the century the rising influence of NGOs. Then in 2005 and 6, there was a trend in which trust shifts from authorities to peers, and also in which a person like me emerges as credible spokesperson. And it goes in a kind of free fall all the way to 2016 and 17, when trust really hits the rock bottom. And in 2017, all 4 institutions of the society, and that is NGOs, media, industry, and governments, are distrusted by people. Then the situation has started improving a little bit. And here you see 2019 versus 2018, where we see a modest rise in trust. And in the lower part of the graph, you see the trust as measured in general population, where you can see that NGOs and businesses on the left-hand side have entered the neutral zone of trust. So NGOs and businesses are neither distrusted nor trusted, while governments and media still remain distrusted in this general population category. In the informed public, NGOs and businesses have reached the level of trust, while government and media remain in a neutral kind of zone. If we look into the trust of European consumers into the food value chain, and these are the results of the EIT food project called Trust Tracker that EUFIC is a part of, you can see that it also stays in the neutral level. So trust is here marked from very little with number 1 to 7, that denotes a very high level of trust. And you can see that overall trust resides in the area of 4 point little something, where trust in farmers seems to be the highest and trust in authorities the lowest. But there is only 1 point difference between the two, and not even. And also the standard deviation is rather high. So I would say it's fair to say that it is in the neutral and not much difference between the actors of the food value chain. So this is what comes from opinion polls, and the opinion polls are obviously shaped by our perception of the world. Still, trust is key to positive relationships, and it is really central to how we communicate with others. And in periods of uncertainties, it becomes even more critical and even more central. And I would say that we witness it now on a daily basis in these times of the pandemic. Now, while social scientists are still discussing the very term trust, it remains a very fine and complex phenomenon. And unlike the common narrative, it is something that cannot be built, not with mortar and pestle. Trust, it is trustworthiness that has to be earned and deserved. And it is based on our competence, on our honesty, and on our reliability. So what is it that we can do to close the trust gap when it comes to nutrition science? How can we design and create the tasty, digestible parcels of truth that people can make sense and use of? Before we dive into it all, I think we need to acknowledge that the nutrition communication suffers from the same universal challenge of science communication, and that is that it is affected by the evolutionary nature of science, by the multitude of communication sources, by the motivation behind each source, and by the diverse nature of the recipients of that information, and of course, by the interplay of these four factors. I would still say that amidst the trust and malnutrition crisis, communication of accurate and actionable information remains a challenge and a priority. We also need to acknowledge that the concepts and terminology that we use in our daily life do not land with everybody in the same way. And also that we may want to ask ourselves whether we know what is it that people want to know about food and health, and whether it should be us preaching our science to them or them asking questions that they're interested in. There was a number of studies that tried to evaluate how people see and perceive the terminology that is used in health and nutrition science. So this study from 2015 looked into how people evaluate healthiness of food. And interestingly, it showed that lay evaluations were highly correlated with the nutrition profile scores. So it showed that lay people use similar criteria as experts to evaluate healthiness. However, while they were pretty well able to evaluate single food products, they struggled in evaluating entire meals, and they tend to neglect the amount of saturated fat, sugar, and sodium in those meals. Another study from the same group looked into how people define terms like nutritiousness and how does it correlate to the expert terminology. And there we saw, or they found, that lay definitions and terminology differed considerably from that of the expert. Well, nutrition experts tend to use terms, and you will find them familiar, like nutrient density, like micro and micronutrients, like expressing energy in kilojoules or calories. When lay people talk about nutritiousness, they talk about fuel, they talk about fresh or natural or body needs or body functioning. And I would just like to give you one more example coming from our own work. EUFIC's work in 2019 and 2020 focused on food-based dietary guidelines and passing the message of the importance of food-based dietary guidelines and translating them into human language. Now, in order to increase impact of our own communication, before we started our campaign, we conducted a digital analysis in order to understand what is it that people talk about when it comes to food-based dietary guidelines, and what is it that they want to know about. Now, to our surprise, no one talks about food-based dietary guidelines. People talk about food pyramids, plates, healthy eating guidelines, but no one mentions food-based dietary guidelines. It's a kind of geeky term that is reserved for use by nutrition professionals, by policymakers, by industry. So this was a little bit of setting a scene to understand the gap between nutrition science and humans, if you want. And now let's look into a little bit of the rules of science communication. Now, according to the EFSA expert panel, when communicating nutrition science, the message should be practical, it should be simple and appealing, it should be pre-tested, it should come in formats and through channels that are adjusted to different audiences. Fine, looks simple, perfect, huh? But communicating nutrition science is actually a science on its own. And there are way more aspects to consider, and each of them with their technical challenges. So the crucial aspects to consider in science communication are the understanding of the hurdles in message uptake, then a very detailed audience segmentation, then message development and tailoring to different segments of the audience, message testing, then identifying the right channels and facilitators, running monitoring and evaluation programs, and then stakeholder engagement and implementation. Now, we cannot all suddenly turn into science communication professionals. So I will spare you the technical details of these aspects of science communication, and I would like to take you through some practical things and tips that we can all apply in our daily life. So yes, there is science to science communication, from setting the stage to properly describing research. But if you think of describing research, that is something that scientists do not need much training for. We can all easily understand and then describe in simple words the model system, the type of the study, the sample size. We can all outline the difference between association and causation, between the absolute and relative risks, and we are well drilled to spell out the limitations of our research or the conflict of interest. Now, the only thing remained for us to do is to set the stage. So to put our research in the right perspective and then make sure that we use clear language with no exaggerations. Then we sprinkle it with a couple of good quotes and we mention the funding sources, and there we are. So the nutrition science communication, in short, should boil down to defining a few simple actionable messages from our research, then linking them to people's values and emotions, focusing on positives, and then using the right channels to reach the right audiences, and then finally being consistent and persistent in what we do. Now, here is where the challenge comes in, especially for scientists, because the rules of simple communication are opposite from everything we were trained during our scientific training. And those rules include using the everyday words, using active verbs, not like in science publications, using a pleasant sentence length, like 15 to 20 words, giving information in logical order, using lists and bullet points. It's important to always be personal and be polite, and we can hardly overdo the visuals. But I'm convinced that with a little bit of training, we can break our own geeky code of writing and, move to talking to humans. And here I wanted to share a EUFIC example of how we turned to making science digestible. It's been a long road for us, and it's not been an easy one, because we all come from the world of science. We are all educated as scientists. And we all started with writing down long, geeky reviews that no one but us would read. But then we were convinced by the evidence coming from cognitive science, which says that we people retain 80% of what we see and about 20% of what we read. And also that we process visuals 60,000 times faster than text. And then when you add to it that visuals are 40 times more likely to be shared on social media, we didn't need much more convincing. So this is not to brag about EUFIC's achievements. This is about, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, yes, we can all shift to simple storytelling. So I would say for us to bridge that trust gap, we need to be where the discussion happens. We need to talk with and not at people, and we shouldn't be shying away from emotions. But there are buts, right? And there are two howevers of nutrition science communication that I would like to draw your attention to. First, nutrition knowledge and health literacy are not critical in our purchasing decisions. It is taste that is still the primary determinant of our food choice, followed by price, with health only as the third concern. So we need more effective ways to persuade people that healthy foods also can taste well and be cost-effective and convenient to prepare. The other, however, is that the messages, regardless of how well-tailored they are, how effective they are, will always be only the first step towards behavior change. But to really change behavior, we need a shift towards more healthier food choices, more exercise opportunities, and more other products and services to facilitate healthy and sustainable food choices. So I would dare to say that we need a paradigm shift in thinking and acting towards healthy, sustainable diets, which takes a concerted effort across the board. And it takes a full alignment among the stakeholders. And this is where the stakeholder engagement comes into the picture. Now, it seems nowadays that whatever we scratch on turns into science. And I would say the same holds for the stakeholder engagement. Call it science or call it art, that's something that really needs to be taken seriously. So when we think of who the stakeholders are, the stakeholder can be anyone that can affect or is affected by our project or by our initiative. Why do we need to understand who the stakeholders are? Well, we need to be able to satisfy their needs in case they're affected by our project, or we need to gain approval and support in case they're the ones who can affect our project, or after all, minimize their opposition or obstruction. It is crucial to involve stakeholders in initial stages when establishing the success criteria and securing a buy-in, and we do so by consulting, listening, understanding, communicating, influencing, negotiating. You see, it all boils down to communication. The critical components of stakeholder engagement are trust, buy-in, relationships, transparency, and communication. And you can see that this is all linked to emotions, feel, and attitudes. And I would say it is feelings and attitudes that will eventually define the success of the initiative. I have listed here the key principles of engagement if we are to ensure that buy-in and to, let's say, build trust. The first principle is communicate, because ineffective or insufficient communication will be at the root of all problems, from unclearly set objectives to poorly coordinated stakeholders. The second crucial thing is to understand what success is. First, we need to understand who the stakeholders are, as well as their relative importance. And then we need to define success for all different stakeholders, and that's very early in the initiative. And it's crucial here to think about not only the KPIs, not only the percentage of salt reduction we want to achieve, or the level of consumer satisfaction. It is about the value that is created for all. So we need to consult early and then to keep consultations frequent. And that is not only in order to just collect useful information or exchange ideas, but also to gain support from the early days of our initiative. And also here, it is crucial to sincerely take interest in stakeholders' views and concerns. Then we need a plan, because making it up as we go along just won't cut it. Every engagement needs to be well planned and resourced, and we need to leave some flexibility to cater for the human factor. The fifth key principle of engagement is relationships. And in gaining the broad stakeholder support, it will help us gain the broad stakeholders support, but also design and deliver the right solutions that are tailored to different stakeholders. And again, it is time consuming, and that time needs to be carefully factored for. And back to emotions, we are all human, and as such, we happen to have feelings. And it is these feelings of support or indifference or opposition that will determine the success or failure of our initiative. And finally, we need to be ready to compromise, because diverging or diametrically opposing views and interests can jeopardize the program. And that is where that relative importance of the stakeholders comes into the picture, because that will help us identify the compromise that is at the center of gravity. So when it comes to nutrition science communications, apart from scientists themselves, the stakeholders include governments, who happen to be humans after all, industry, who very much values its place at the table, healthcare professionals, among others, always in need of simple tools, and people who need a point of trust. And I would say the focus in any stakeholder engagement should be on constructive collaboration and on common interest, so on co-benefits rather than trade-offs. And here I would like to give you an example of tailored stakeholder engagement. And I would like to base it on the learnings from a survey that we in EUFIC have run on communication around food reformulation. So using here food reformulation as an example, it is about this time last year that we ran an in-house survey among our members. And I will remind you that among our members, we have about 50-50 of industry and other stakeholders, so across the stakeholder sectors. What we wanted to understand was their perception of the language used when communicating about food reformulation. And then we wanted to understand their perception of the language that should be used when communicating to different stakeholders. Now, despite the fact that they come from different stakeholder sectors, the outcome of this exercise was very much overlapping between the sectors. So when we talk about the perception of language used by governments, they came across as correct, neutral, diplomatic, factual, and dogmatic. The public health authorities were seen as using language which is, again, correct and neutral and diplomatic, but also preaching to the converted and dogmatic. Scientists were seen as using language which is factual and nuanced, but also preachy and also overcomplicated. Industry apparently used language which was pragmatic and realistic, but then also defensive, boasty about positives, and commercially driven. For NGOs, the perception was that their language was fear-inducing, random, unsubstantiated, sensationalized, and threatening even. And the language used by the media was seen as polarizing, inconsistent, and oversimplified. Now, when we asked about what should be the different value propositions when communicating about food reformulation to different stakeholders, here is the outcome of the survey. So according to our members, when talking to governments, the communication about food reformulation should be stressing the aspects of food reformulation enabling safer, more nutritious, more affordable or sustainable food choices, helping improve public health and helping decrease public health costs. When talking to industry about food reformulation, the aspects that should be stressed should go around the return of investment when providing healthier options through innovation, about healthier people, which means better purchasing power, about answering increased consumer demands, which means opportunities for growth, about owning their corporate social responsibility and contributing to more sustainable food systems. When communicating to healthcare professionals, the value proposition should go around safer, more nutritious food choice, the opportunity to shift focus towards promotion rather than restriction, about making healthier choices easier, and about improved public health. And when talking to consumers, the value should be put on easier, safe, nutritious, affordable, sustainable food choice, which can also be personalized, and about personal gains, which include healthiness, taste, sustainability, and social positioning. So I guess I use the food formulation example to make a point, and that is that communicating about nutrition science in stakeholder engagement should be about more than only health benefits. It should enable an open dialogue and create an atmosphere of trust and transparency. It should be able to identify challenges and opportunities across sectors, highlight the co-benefits to ensure a buy-in, ensure alignment and consistency of messages across sectors, and strike the balance right and focus on positive messaging. So the takeaway message would be that if done well, communicating about nutrition science in stakeholder engagement could inspire governments and public health authorities to engage other stakeholders and reach the public health targets, could inspire companies to strive for optimization of their food products, healthcare professionals to educate consumers and drive the behavior change, media and NGOs to work in the interest of consumers and to support raising population awareness, and finally consumers to make healthier lifestyle choices. So to increase the impact of our own work and to improve public health, I think we need to think out of the box and get out of our nutrition silo and team up with people, also the non-usual suspects. So this is where I leave you with this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Milka, for that fantastic presentation. I'm just setting up, transferring back over to me. So I think we've done it all right. Someone can let me know quickly if they can see my screen, but hopefully everyone can just see the two of us now. So thank you ever so much for that, Milka. It was a fantastic presentation. I thought your data on trust levels was really interesting, and also all your advice around different methods or how we should be thinking about our communication about nutrition science is really important for every level of our communication, and not just leaving it to kind of the food-based dietary guidelines or the government advice. It's every level that really matters. So I think there's things that everyone can take away and think about in their communication as well. We have a couple of questions to ask from our audience. The first one I have is, what do you see as the major challenges that might prevent clear communication about the latest nutrition science?
I think when it comes to clear communication, the major challenges probably lie in the areas where there is no clarity among scientists or no agreement among scientists themselves. So think of the examples like carbs versus fat camps in science, or think of the classification of processed food and the impact of food processing on health. So I think where there is no clear agreement in science, there is opportunity for more confusion. So I would say that's where the major challenges are, and that's where probably we should put most effort into aligning among ourselves and clarifying things.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Another question is regulation limiting our communication to the consumer?
I guess that depends on your departure point. So it depends on which position are you communicating from. So if you are talking about food products, specific food products or brands, I think there your communication will be much regulated. And that means you will have to comply with health claim regulation and what have you. But if you are only talking about the results of your only talking about the results of your scientific research, there is no regulation. If you are using social media as your communication platform, you know, you need to stick to the truth, and there is ethics that binds you to telling the truth, but there is no regulation to it.
Okay, lovely, thank you very much. The next question, do you have any tips to maximize virtual and online impact, since this is the main vehicle for nutrition science communication now? So yeah, virtual and online. Virtual and online, it's all about visuals. You know, we have no physical contact. It's difficult to get our, you know, exchange the body language properly. So it will be using the least possible amount of letters and the most possible amount of audio visuals. Yeah, that would probably be the advice. Okay, lovely. What's the best platform, website or social media, or the best tool, whether it's video, podcast or written, to communicate science to HCPs and to the public? So I would say the best. Yeah. I would say the platforms, the choice of platform will depend on your target audience. So from our own experience in EUFIC, we see way more communication and engagement with healthcare professionals or nutrition professionals via, for instance, Twitter. While with general public, we communicate easier through Facebook and Instagram. So I guess different channels or different platforms for different audiences. And then when it comes to tools, again, it boils down to visuals and audio visuals. So both the general public and healthcare professionals will need simplification of science. Healthcare professionals to use it as a tool in communicating their messages to their clients or patients. And the general public just needs the simplicity and trustworthiness. Lovely, thank you. And then what are your top tips for using communication successfully for creating research impact?
All right, that depends on what we want to achieve. Like, what is the impact that we want to reach? If we want to see our science translated into policy, then we can go back to all that we have just discussed about how to engage different policymakers. So the tip would be to understand, sorry, not policymakers, but stakeholders. So the tip would be to understand who your crucial stakeholders are, what are their needs, what are their interests, what is it that they want to achieve, and then align communication with their expectations and needs.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Hopefully they've answered your questions. Elaine, did you want to turn your microphone on and share some more questions with us if you'd had some?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of more questions in there for Milka. The first one, Milka, is how do you convey the ever-changing nature of research and science without appearing inconsistent or hesitant in your message?
That's, yeah, the million-dollar question. We just need to keep repeating the science is a live thing. It changes. And that's what we also need to pass to our audiences. Every day science brings something new, and that doesn't mean inconsistencies, that means new learnings. And I think we just need to be persistent ourselves in explaining to people that this is not us changing our minds every day, every second day. It is about you know, finding new learnings coming from science.
Thanks, Milka. And just one more question there for you. So why do you think the public perception of trust in the NGO sector is not reflected in the perceptions of stakeholders in the quality of the NGO communication? Sorry, the assessment of stakeholders. What was the NGO communications? They were fear-inducing, random, or unsubstantiated, etc.
Yeah. I don't have the answer to that one. So what Edelman did is really a huge global surveys of trust. What we did is, you know, really limited survey among 30 stakeholders. So you can see there already a discrepancy. So I guess the stakeholders that we have surveyed may just already have a preformed picture of the NGOs working in their field, while the Edelman Trust Barometer actually goes across NGOs across all sectors and globally.
Okay, great. And I actually have a couple of more questions for you. So firstly, how do we escape the Nutri-silo?
We reach out to psychologists, behavior change scientists, environmentalists. You know, there are so many different aspects that impact what we do, or the impact that the implementation of what we do, that we haven't been taking into consideration in the olden age of nutrition science. But now you cannot detach them one from another anymore. So if we're going to talk about healthy, sustainable food systems or healthy and sustainable diet, we need to understand what sustainability means, and that will be impacted by, you know, the environmental impact of food production, the environmental impact of food consumption. So it is really about reaching out to people from the sectors that we are not used to. So the non-usual suspects, and, you know, talking to them, understand the angles they come from, and then aligning messages across the stakeholders.
Great. And just in relation to the survey on food reformulation, we've had a question here. Would you be able to share the full findings of that study?
So this was an informal study, and pretty much the full findings is what I presented to you here. I'm happy to share the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you, Milka. And just one final question from me. Just in today's world, social media is king. What advice would you give to nutrition science professionals who want to be true to the scientific complexity, but also to engage a broad target audience?
We can't ignore the complexity. So we need to convey the message that there is underlying complexity to what we are talking about, but we really need to simplify the message. So take dietary fats, for example. People don't need to understand the structure of all the different fats. They don't need to understand the molecular structure of them. They need to just get the gist of it. They need to understand what saturated fats are in terms of the impact they have on your health and what not saturated fats do. They don't need to understand double bonds and no double bonds and what have you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Elaine, for filtering in some of those questions. So I think that's all our questions for you, Milka, and you can now sit back and relax and enjoy the rest of the day. To all of the audience, I just wanted to let you know we have recorded this webinar and we're just exploring options of how we can share it through the ENLP going forward. So keep an eye on social media for an announcement on when or if it's available after the webinar as well. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much to Milka for kindly presenting the very first webinar. A little bit daunting for us all. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for joining us as well and for all of your questions. It was great to have quite an interactive session, so that was really helpful for us. We hope you enjoyed it. There will be a short survey that comes out to all of you once we end the webinar, and that will be really useful for us as a committee to know how to run these in the future and whether you're interested in future webinars as well. So we'd be grateful if you could fill that out. But that just leaves me to say thank you again and have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.